uneasy at first. Please be patient with me. Uh, I want to thank the UU for inviting me to share some time with you this morning. I also want to take a moment to give honor to the Creator and to the ancestors, because I sit in a room where I'm surrounded by pictures of my ancestors. I selected the letter from the Birmingham jail by Dr. King, because in this particular letter, he states very firmly that what is most people consider normal is actually chaos for many people. And so my title this morning is From Chaos Comes Creativity. Dr. King gives us the steps in moving from chaos to creativity in this process. As Laura noted, I work at the Poor People's Campaign, and Reverend Barber has also, and the campaign has also talked about the normalcy in this country is really a deadly chaos for almost half of the population of this country at the time. So my belief is that if we've got to go through this period of chaos in order to create a beloved community, a justice community, and an inclusive community. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about some situations of chaos which have resulted in creation. If we look at the Greek interpretation of the book of Genesis, it says that from chaos, the world was formed. I think back to one of the lowest periods for enslaved Africans in this country was in 1857, when the Supreme Court decided that in the Dred Scott case, that the Constitution was not meant to include Blacks. And a statement was made in the statement that no Black person had any rights that a white man was bound to respect. And that was a low point for people like Frederick Douglass and many others. But just 3 years later, the country entered into a civil war, which ultimately resulted of the emancipation of enslaved Africans in the Confederate States. 1955, the brutal murder of a young boy by the name of Emmett Till was a horrific experience, a disgusting experience, a frightening experience in the lives of Blacks in this country. But just 4 months later, the Montgomery bus boycott began. And that opened the door for the modern civil rights movement. It was not the first time that someone had attempted to sit down in the white section of the bus, or even attempted to even integrate public accommodations. There was something about the Emmett Till murder that actually sparked a movement. And in rapid succession, in the next few years, we saw other chaotic moments. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which took the lives of 4 young Black girls while they were at Sunday school. The use of dogs and fire hose against children, Black children, who were marching for voting rights and for equality. And we're all seen in the past week clips of the brutal beating of John Lewis and others of the Emmett Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. I remember as a child watching these on television and in many ways being frightened. These situations had been occurring for years, and whites in particular knew about it. But because of the new thing called the television, it was about this time that television broke the 50% mark of being in American homes. And we saw for the first time the experience of chaotic life that Blacks have been experiencing since our arrival in this country. And very shortly after seeing this on television, we had the passage of the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So every time there's been a chaotic situation, a major chaotic situation, we have seen a new creation. I think back to the AIDS epidemic that ravaged our country. Homophobia prevented us from initially taking charge and dealing with it. And between 1981 and the year 2000, 450,000 Americans died from this disease. Who knew when we were fighting in that war, dealing with that pandemic, that in 2014, the Supreme Court would grant marriage equality? And this year, the Supreme Court decided that federal law covers sexual orientation and gender expression. So there's been a sequence of chaotic events happening, and then something new occurring, some new creation occurring. We're now in a time of chaos. There's no doubt about it. We've known for the past decade or so that weekly, young Black and brown men and women have been brutally murdered by the police. But there was something about that police officer putting his knee on the neck of George Floyd and taking his life, and hearing about an unarmed Breonna Taylor murdered in her home by mistaken identity, trumped up charges that has sparked a revolution, a chaotic revolution in this country. And what has happened is, as Dr. King wrote, we are now collecting the incidents, we're listing those things of trauma that have occurred within the community. But privilege does not give up power very easily. And when I thought about this, I thought about Colin Kaepernick, when he took a peaceful knee at a football game, trying to call attention to police brutality. And what ended up happening was the team ownership, the president, and many others converted that to him, saying that he was disrespecting the flag. He was disrespecting the Constitution. They wanted to ignore his true reason for why he was doing this. The president even called Cullen an inflammatory name. And his supporters applauded, most of whom professed to be evangelical Christians. You know, and yet if I post that phrase on Facebook, they would censor me. As Laura said, that this marks the 60th anniversary of my involvement in social justice movements. We've seen this week much clipped discussion about the life of John Lewis and his very humble beginnings. I heard at the service how he preached to the chickens and found ways to escape work. His parents were sharecroppers, and now he's a member of Congress. Most justice warriors have similar starts. I myself grew up in segregated Roanoke, Virginia. I spent much of my formative years in the Negro Housing Project. I went to all Black schools from K through 12. My own experience has been riding on the back of the bus, sitting at separate lunch counters, being denied public accommodations, being treated, having to use the colored restrooms and drinking from colored water fountains. The dynamics were set in place for me to grow up to be a second-class citizen. But the God that I serve and the ancestors had a different plan for me. I won't take time to tell you about my own personal journey because I'll be here all day. But having spent 45 years in predominantly white institutions as a student, staff, faculty, administrator, and senior level administration later, I have learned a lot about the culture of whiteness and white privilege. I'm known as a diversity trainer and leader, and as Laura mentioned, I've been recognized for doing that kind of work over the years. But I want to share a few of the observations that I have. I found in my experience that when I've done these workshops, the most difficult people to engage, to truly honestly engage, are those who consider themselves to be progressive folks, well-meaning progressive folks. It is the most difficult for them to really, they want to declare themselves devoid of the influence of whiteness and have a difficult time identifying how they benefit from having privilege, but more difficult in identifying how they contribute to maintaining the system of privilege. Through passive aggressive behavior, they tend to be gatekeepers for whiteness. I've experienced this in universities and community organizations alike. They are very comfortable giving a hand down or a hand out, but not a hand up or a hand over. I was sharing with a young man the other day, it is difficult to not, for some folks to not be the center of the activities. And there are a lot of strategies that happens to that. There's a tendency to avoid conflict and chaos, and they want to focus on being civil and pleasant, which I define as a way of avoid truth-telling. It's a way of avoiding addressing real issues. If we can just get along and not get angry and not get upset and just be nice to each other. I hear a lot of good talk, but very little good walking the walk. One of the things in my teaching, I'm going to divert from my notes. One of the things when I work with the groups, I tell them that justice work takes place on 3 different levels. It's the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the institutional. At one point, I was responsible for organizing a year-long management training program on diversity with about 150 administrators in my campus. And I brought in a well-known person to do this. And what ended up happening was there was a lot of revolt on a campus which professes to be very community-oriented, very liberal, very progressive, in an area that for the 2 elections voted 80% for Barack Obama. I mean, these were all real good folks. And yet when we asked them to start looking at the intrapersonal work, it became difficult for them, impossible. Because we have to look at, when we do the intrapersonal, all the tapes that we have, that we continue to get from television, from religion, from education, from the healthcare system, from the legal system, you name it. It's the intrapersonal work that is the linchpin for starting to do justice work. After I retired from the university declared, they were patient on me, they declared that they were going to spend the next 2 years focusing on interpersonal relationships. That if they could just learn to be nice to each other, if they could just say the right words to each other, use the right pronouns and whatever, that would have solved the issues around diversity. That too has failed. But in the workshop I've been doing, I found that it was difficult for us. You know, I've done hundreds of workshops. And one of the things I asked people to do is, initially I used to ask them to help us define the group organizing rules. What are the rules that we're going to agree upon? And almost initially everybody will say, we're going to be truth and be open and honest here. And at some point I said, you know, that's not true. Y'all want to be pleasant. That in the Eurocentric environment, being pleasant takes the priority over telling the truth. There are 2 books that I use in my teaching. I found one of them because I got thousands of books in the house. And one of the books is called Love is Letting Go of Fear. It's by Joel Jampolsky. I don't know if you have recognized that book, but in his work of Love is Letting Go of Fear, what he tells us is that humans have only 2 base emotions, love and fear. And in order for us to grow, we have to let go of our fear. I use that in a group setting because when we do diversity work, the interpersonal requires us to pay attention to our fears. It requires us to come to the grip that maybe mama and the grandpa that we love and the preacher that we serve may have been wrong in what they've been telling us. And so in the book, Love is Letting Go of Fear, I have decided that I want to say that love and fear cannot exist in the same place. We can say, well, I love everybody, but if we stacked up with fear, that cannot be true. And we can find, if you follow the Christian concept, you know, there are words that will tell us that love and fear, not love and hate, because hate comes from fear. The second book, which I use a lot, I don't know if you can see that, is Do I Have to Give Up Me to Be Loved by You? And the authors have a similar premise. They say that humans only have two basic intents, either to learn or to protect. And much of what I found in justice work with individual groups and collectively, as Dr. King would say, sometimes the individual is right, but the group ain't. And where I found that we spend a lot of time protecting our race, our false truth, our history, our money, our reputation, our privilege, our supremacy. And if we do that, we cannot create the beloved community. Even recently, we look, how many of us are fighting to maintain the Confederate statues, most of which were erected in the 1950s to fight against civil rights? We've created a mystic history about those darn statues. We are supporting an insurrection and at the same time waving the American flag. And we want to protect that falseness. My experience in justice work is until we stop protecting and start telling the truth, we will never get into doing justice work, not to doing real justice work. We will have meetings and we will talk. And as I started to say, when I do justice work, and I sit in with a group and I say to them, what is the outcome you desire of this experience? What's the outcome that you desire from having a diversity committee, whether it's on a city level or a college level or whatever? And what I found is, particularly for majority culture people, they will refuse to define an outcome. And for people of color, this is not just another kumbaya moment. And so what I experience is, oftentimes we bring together a committee and the people of color say, I don't know, I done this 12 times. You know, I'm not sure what is this going to achieve? And so my stress today is when we do that, which is our normalcy, do you see we're creating chaos? You know, and then we get upset when people call us out to say, this is chaos. You know, I have to read this because it's not my quote. I'm reading Eddie Goss's new book, and in it, early on, he quotes James Baldwin, who writes to Robert Kennedy after the death of John Kennedy. And he says, to see what was the root of all our troubles, that is, for the most part, human beings refused to live honestly with themselves and were all too willing to hide behind the idols of race and ready to kill in order to defend them. So part of what it is, I was talking to with my son, professional son, who says that we have to have real conversation before we can have real action and real transformation. This is the stage of chaos that we're starting to go into. Very briefly, because Laura asked, you know, I work with Dr. Barber in the Poor People's Campaign. And Dr. Barber added something to the conversation. The work I had done for much of my life had been around single topics, whether it was voting rights or public accommodations or women's right to choose. The list goes on. Reverend Barber started talking about the interconnection of systematic racism, systematic poverty, environmental devastation, excessive spending in military, and changing the narrative about poor people. This wasn't a single topic issue. There is a whole systematic in place. And one of the things I noticed in this campaign and in the current movement, and I even heard John Lewis in his speeches and Elijah Cummings, and before he transitioned, is the word systematic is becoming a part of the vocabulary of this justice movement. It's not just about voter suppression. It's not just about polluted water. It's not just about denying equal rights for LGBTQI folks. Is a system is in place, a hegemony that allows the 1% or the 2% to control the country. From this chaos, and I believe that we're going to be in the chaos for a long time. I honestly believe it. I believe it's my bishop, and I say, we're in a holy timeout. And what are we going to do in this holy timeout? You can see a whole lot of people are fighting. And we're trying to go back to what is normal. We're even willing to sacrifice our elderly and our children for $1. But our normalcy has been chaos. Prior to this epidemic, we had 140 poor and low wealth individuals in this country. We now are probably approaching over 175 million poor and low wealth people. Many of the jobs aren't coming back. We had 30 million people without health care, and this pandemic is showing us the results of what not having a nationalized, we can call it Medicare for all, whatever the name we want to call it, but we have a system that we're the only country in the civilized world that does not take care of its poor. Medical issues are the #1 cause of bankruptcy in this country. We're the only free Western country that this happens in. We're the only country that consistently and continuously denies climate change. This is what we want to call normal. That what normal is chaos. And until we decide to be, until a new kind of chaos disrupts our normalcy, we cannot move into a time of a new and recreation. My thought is that I may not be here for that new creation. I feel like Dr. King and maybe Moses and some other people who say, Dr. King said, I'm going to the top of the mountain. I can see it, but I may not get to the other side. It may take years, it may take decades. But as a theology student, we had to take an exegesis class. And the one book of the Bible I didn't want to study was Revelation. I just didn't want to do that. Well, the ancestors decided that's the class I was going to take. And what I learned in that it was not about the end times. It was really about, John the Seer was telling us, he was addressing the injustice of the Romans toward the other people. That's what the book of Revelation is all about. We've been hoodwinked into believing it's in something else. I'm glad to be alive in the time of Revelation, because what we're revealing is the hegemony, the injustice, the willingness of a few with power to go to any extreme to maintain that power. And yet what we're seeing in the streets now is not just Black folks and not just brown folks, but we're starting to see Reverend Barber has harnessed poor folks. As he says, the coal miners in Appalachia, the white coal miners in Appalachia were the Black dirt farmers of the Delta. And what he has done differently in this campaign is he is working to empower the marginalized and disenfranchised. And so if you participate in the June 20th event or go to any of his rallies, you won't see a lot of talking heads from politicians and religious leaders and so forth. You're bringing people forward to tell their story. When I read the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible and some other sacred texts, this is the call to justice. This is the call that we're doing. This is the preparation for New Jerusalem. I'm a firm believer that I've given up looking for Jesus to come back. I'm a firm believer that we are charged to create heaven here on earth. That's our duty. A duty of creating justice and love and inclusion. And when I read the Bible as one of my texts, that's all I see. It's a book of liberation. It's not a book about sin. It's not a book about going to hell. It's not a book about thou shalt not. And we humans have made about 500,000 thou shalt nots. But it's a book about liberation. And the divine is on the side of the oppressed. And so with that, my belief, we are charged to create a new Jerusalem. And we can call it a new Mecca. I'm not hooked into what name we call it based on our own faith path. But in this period of chaos, that's our charge. And rather than doing as we do in groups, finding ways to resist it and to be nice about it, we have to go for that Kairos moment. Because the Kairos moment means we sit and work with it until the Spirit enlightens us. And with that, I'm going to say thank you.